In the first chaotic days of the invasion, the world clung to a legend. It needed one. When thousands of Russian troops surged over the border into Ukraine and explosions lit up the horizon and armored convoys aimed for Kyiv, there was a collective global gasp that felt fatalistic. Then came a myth that pushed back against despair. The story of the Ghost of Kyiv, a lone heroic fighter pilot in a MiG-19, supposedly defending the capital, shooting down Russian jets in the skies with almost cinematic ruthlessness. Grainy video clips, miscaptioned combat footage, shaky targets burning against blue sky, all allegedly the work of this single ace. The legend exploded faster than the missiles. The internet crowned him a superhero. Social media treated him like a modern skyborne avenger, a masked pilot inside the cockpit of a Cold War relic, seemingly reborn into digital age folklore. Memes, videos, Telegram threads, gaming forums, aviation Reddit communities, and Discord channels began tracking his confirmed kills, dissecting shadow silhouettes of jets, obsessing over cockpit HUD reflections, turning anonymous military footage into modern myth-making. Each claim of a Russian jet spiraling down became another brick in the story, and every brick mattered. For a shocked global audience watching a smaller nation face a superpower head-on, it was psychologically necessary. The Ghost wasn't just a pilot in a jet. He was resistance personified, airborne defiance delivered at 30,000 feet. He was hope at supersonic speed. But Ukraine later clarified that the Ghost was never one single person. It was a symbol, a collective spirit built from the exhausted but unbreakable pilots and crews of Ukraine's Air Force. And here lies one of the earliest ironies of the war. Russia launched its invasion with overwhelming military assets, but Ukraine launched its defense with overwhelming imagination, and then weaponized it into reality. Ukraine knew myth could become morale, and morale could become power. That clarified narrative was propaganda, yes, but propaganda is only a lie when it collapses under pressure. This one hardened instead. It mutated into reality, embedding itself into Ukraine's defense DNA. Because while the world debated whether one pilot could really down 6 jets in a day, Ukraine was quietly proving that an entire air force, strengthened by strategy, improvisation, external support, and ruthless adaptation, could down hundreds across months. On paper, in February 2022, this was not a fair fight. It was not even a close fight. It looked suicidal. Russia entered the war with one of the largest and most sophisticated air forces on Earth. Hundreds of fourth-generation multi-role fighters such as the Su-30, Su-35, as well as strategic bombers like the Su-34. These aircraft were equipped with long-range detection systems, jamming technology, networked radar, electronic warfare suites, and long-range missiles like the R-77. Their doctrine was built around seeing first and striking first: suppression, shock dominance, radar disruption, missile saturation, airborne command coordination. Russian aviators trained inside a system obsessed with projection of air superiority and battlefield sky control. Ukraine, by comparison, flew an older, smaller, lighter-armed Soviet legacy fleet of MiG-29 and Su-27 aircraft. Older radars, shorter-range missiles like the R-27, limited BVR, beyond visual range, capability, outdated avionics, aging airframes, overworked engines. It was the air war equivalent of facing a boss enemy in a Level 3 loadout. If war was predictable, Ukraine would have never been able to lift off in the first place, so Russia launched what it thought would be a knockout blow, a decapitation strike targeting airfields, radar centers, command bases, jet hangars, and military communication hubs. Cruise missiles like the Kalibr screamed over the landscape, while ballistic missiles like the Iskander smashed into fixed air bases. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Eliminate Ukrainian aviation on the ground in 48 hours, then rule the skies for the remaining 48 weeks, drop bombs with impunity, coordinate paratrooper insertions, escort armored advancements with near-total battlefield air dominance. But Ukraine and its pilots did something strategically genius. They refused to be exactly where the enemy expected them to be. Instead of meeting Russia in the sky, they met Russia in its expectations and broke them. Ukraine had dispersed its aircraft early, moving jets to smaller airstrips, civilian airports, makeshift runways, forest edge airstrips, highway landing zones. This decentralization protected expensive assets from initial missile barrages and preserved its functional fleet. Russian missiles cratered empty bases. The targets they thought they destroyed were digital ghosts of aircraft that were no longer there. Ukraine also kept its air defense mobile. Soviet-era surface-to-air systems like the S-300, Buk M1, and later Western-donated systems like Iris-T, NASAMS, Patriot, and Gepard constantly moved positions, denying Russian SAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, aircraft the ability to lock on and destroy them easily. Once Russia realized Ukraine's jets were still operational, they launched new waves of fighters. But the stalemate that followed changed the air war from dominance doctrine into survival doctrine. Russian pilots now had to fight cautiously over Ukrainian air defense bubbles. A single launch could mean instant death. Ukraine was forced into defensive combat. Russia was restricted to standoff bombardment. Missiles launched from inside Russian airspace or Belarusian airspace, glide bombs dropped from far outside radar lock range, cruise missiles used as primary strike force instead of jets, Su-34 bombers being escorted with distance rather than precision. Ukraine's older jets were still outgunned, but their pilots were not outplanned. And here's something most analysts underestimated early. Ukrainian aviators had one advantage Russia couldn't bomb away: hunger. Desperation breeds adaptation, and Ukraine adapted faster than the West could ship it weapons. Ukrainian engineers began integrating Western weapons into Soviet jets. The integration was Frankenstein-tier technical wizardry. The British Storm Shadow and French Scalp missiles were suction-mounted into Soviet-era electronics, allowing old Su-24 strike bombers to suddenly launch stealth cruise missiles with 250-plus kilometers, 155 miles, range. Ukraine now possessed a scalpel for deep strikes. Russian command posts, supply bridges, ammo depots, and logistics hubs were no longer secure. MiG-29 and Su-27 fighters were fitted to fire. U.S.-donated HARM anti-radiation missiles, radar-seeking munitions designed to destroy Russian S-400 or S-300 radar arrays by homing in on their emissions. This was unprecedented. This was not modernization. This was improvisational weapon system translation under bombardment. Suddenly, Ukraine's air force became unpredictable. It could strike without warning. It could blind air defense networks. It could fire long-range stealth missiles from older airframes. Russia's air defense went from hunter to hunted because suddenly every radar switch on could be missile bait. Ukraine also integrated ground-launched drone warfare into air command loops. UAVs were no longer just recon toys. They became targeting data providers for jet pilots, real-time battlefield networking, shared coordinates, shared missile launch windows, shared target signatures, drone-fed lock-on opportunities delivered to pilots flying higher and farther than Russian radars could reach. Ukraine's pilots were beginning to look less like underdogs and more like hackers inside legacy hardware. Then the West delivered the machines that finally tipped the balance in pure fighting capability. Starting in summer 2024, the first F-16 fighters began arriving. These weren't just jets. They were compatibility hubs for all NATO-grade weapons Ukraine was already experimenting with. But now the weapons weren't jury-rigged. They were native. M120 AMRAAM missiles gave Ukrainian pilots true BVR capability, 100-plus kilometer range, fire-and-forget tracking, autonomous terminal guidance, pilots no longer forced into radar-lock suicides during missile flight. Ukraine could see and shoot from safety. It could fire and break away instantly. A single jet in December 2024 reportedly downed 6 cruise missiles in a single sortie. The fighter shift was real. But the Ghost wasn't one jet. It was the systemic rebirth of an airborne doctrine, improvisation, decentralization, Western weapons integration, drone-fed radar blending, psychological myth hardening into battlefield strategy. Ukraine refused to die in the air, long enough to be reborn in it. The psychological and strategic shock of Ukraine's survival phase carried Russia into a trap it didn't fully recognize until the losses were already irreversible. In the early weeks of the war, Russian fighter pilots flew with the confidence of a force expecting swift dominance, believing their advanced radars, electronic warfare suites, and long-range missiles would keep Ukrainian aviation grounded or powerless. But the war didn't unfold in weeks. It unfolded in adaptations, surprises, and persistence. And by 2024, the initial blueprint for Russian air superiority had been completely rewritten, not by one dramatic event, but by hundreds of incremental battlefield shocks that piled into one unmistakable reality. Ukraine was no longer fighting to preserve its air force. It was fighting to reinvent it, mid-battle, while in full view of the world. By late 2025, Ukraine wasn't contesting the sky. It was contesting the narrative of who deserved to own the sky. Official Ukrainian military statements credited their forces with destroying over 430 Russian fixed-wing aircraft since the start of the conflict. Conservative open-source intelligence trackers only log confirmed aircraft losses when they are visually verified with photographic or video evidence, and even those show that Russia has lost well over 350 aircraft of all types. While Ukraine's figures emphasize the full scope of the impact, OSINT figures emphasize the minimum confirmed truth. And in both cases, the reality is devastating for Russia. This is not a handful of losses that can be categorized as routine attrition. This is the prolonged collapse of an air imbalance once presumed impossible. More importantly, this isn't the destruction of outdated or disposable airframes. This is the destruction of high-value, strategically critical aircraft that occupy the centerline of Russian air doctrine. Dozens of Su-34 fullback bombers, precision strike aircraft designed to shape battlefield flow from the sky, gone. Numerous Su-30 escort fighters, multi-role guardians of bomber routes, wiped. Su-35 air dominance fighters, some of the most lethal aircraft in Russia's arsenal, eliminated at scale. And then there was the catastrophic loss that shook not only strategies, but psychology, the downing of an A-50 airborne early warning and command aircraft. The A-50 is one of Russia's most expensive and valuable aviation assets, worth over $300 million per airframe. But money isn't the core issue. Function is. The A-50 acts as an airborne nerve center. Long-range detection, strategic target logging, battlefield command loops, communications coordination, electromagnetic situational awareness distribution, fighter-bomber orchestration, and early interception planning. When you remove an A-50 from the sky, you don't just remove a plane. You remove the ability of the entire air network to operate as a coherent and synchronized battlefield system. The void left by losing an A-50 is an invisible injury of immense proportions. Russia instantly lost long-range airborne radar dominance from an elevated command platform that could detect Ukrainian fighters deep inside contested territory. They lost real-time coordination loops that synchronized bomber escort alignments mid-sortie. They lost the ability to detect Ukrainian missile, drone, or airborne strike paths from farther distances. Their interception response time slowed because what was once processed and coordinated at airborne altitude was suddenly forced into slower, grounded command channels. And perhaps most critically, the pilots themselves changed. Confidence evaporated. Doubt hardened. The belief that the sky could be safe for Russian aircraft vanished. Because no matter how advanced a fighter jet might be, a fighter pilot that doubts their early warning cover, doubts their radar usage windows, doubts their communication pathways, and fears that every signal emission might be tactical bait, is no longer a pilot executing air superiority doctrine. They are a pilot executing air survival doctrine. And survival doctrine costs not only accuracy, but morale. After the A-50 kills, Russian pilots began shutting down radar suites mid-flight to avoid attracting anti-radiation weapons that hunt electronic emissions. That alone didn't just limit their battlefield visibility, it dismantled it. Electronic warfare suites designed to jam Ukrainian command radar blending corridors ended up being switched into passive safety modes mid-sortie. Long-range missiles launched inside BVR strike windows were forced into edge-range firings. Less energy, slower terminal velocity, more vulnerable to interception, easier to evade. And Ukraine exploited every moment. Because Ukraine didn't simply want parity. They wanted uncertainty for Russia. Parity destroys aircraft. Uncertainty destroys doctrine. That fleeing psychological downgrade bled Russia into humiliating standoff bombing behavior. Su-35 and Su-30 fighters were relegated into airborne missile launch mules, sprinting toward the edge of Ukrainian air defense range, dumping payloads, then fleeing instantly back into Russian airspace. Su-34 strike bombers, designed to conduct orchestrated battlefield-shaping precision bombing sorties, abandoned deep-cut standoff strike flight paths, instead launching glide bombs from ultra-distance drop points that were not optimized for precision, but for escape velocity. The doctrines were inverted. Russian aviation once built its air playbook around offensive and defensive sky coverage. Now they build it around flight avoidance windows, radar blackout windows, max-range missile firing windows, and safe return corridors mapped around Ukrainian air defense bubbles. They stopped dogfighting. They stopped low-altitude operational diving. They stopped airborne combined arms escort coordination. They stopped using their air network to protect ground operations. Ukraine didn't simply strip away air dominance. They stripped away the psychological permission to believe air dominance was still possible. Ukraine then delivered that permission for collapse deep inside Russian air sanctuaries, using swarms of low-cost long-range drones to strike aircraft on the ground at air bases that were never supposed to be threatened. These drone attacks were not symbolic. They were doctrinal assaults. Unlike high-cost aircraft that require airframes, pilots, fuel, ammunition, training, planning, communication, radars, and airborne command doctrine to strike effectively, drones require stealth, distance, swarm projection, electromagnetic evasion, improvisational launch points. Gripens provide fuel, distance, short runway capability, low operating costs, decentralized sortie optimization, and improvised runway compatibility. A perfect marriage to Ukraine's aircraft dispersal doctrine. And dispersal doctrine saved Ukraine. Now it haunts Russia. This war is not simply fought in airspace. It's fought in expectations, systems, psychology, improvisation, and persistence hardened into precision. Because Russia entered the war trying to own the sky, Ukraine entered the sky refusing to be owned by expectations. Now Ukraine owns the air turnaround. Not mythically, systemically. And this is why the Ghost of Kyiv legend didn't die when it was debunked. It multiplied when it was clarified. Russia isn't losing to a pilot. Russia is losing to a legend, turned system, turned doctrine, turned future deterrence identity. The ghosts are airborne, not alone, but everywhere. And that everywhere is a place Russia never planned to defend, never planned to fear, and once assumed it would permanently dominate. But assumptions don't fly jets in war. Pilots do. And Ukraine forged its ghosts into a sky Russia now avoids at all costs. Because the ghosts don't just fly jets, they fly strategies. And strategies? Those are harder to shoot down than aircraft.